In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
It is 100% real. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Curious Dimension podcast, where we explore the mysteries of the unknown, delve into the fascinating world of UFO disclosure, sacred geometry, crop circles, and more. I'm your host, Matt Barone. Hope that you've been enjoying the conversations as much as I've been hosting them. Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us reach more curious minds like yours. And if you want to stay updated with all our latest episodes, be sure to hammer that subscribe button. You won't want to miss any of the exciting discussions we have lined up. Finally, we love hearing from you. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on today's episode or any questions you might have. Your feedback means the world to me and helps shape future content. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of telepathy and the extraordinary abilities of the human mind. Joining us is none other than Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell, a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and author of the ESP Enigma. Dr. Powell has conducted groundbreaking research with autistic savants, uncovering evidence of telepathic communication that challenges everything we know about human consciousness. Her work has not only inspired scientific debates, but also the popular podcast, Telepathy Tapes. In this episode, we'll explore the mind-blowing cases of telepathy Dr. Powell has documented, what this means for our understanding of the brain and consciousness, and how these discoveries could redefine science and human potential. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell. All right, Diane, we are rocking and rolling. How are you this evening?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Very good, very good. I've been looking forward to this for some time now. I'm about halfway through your book, the ESP Enigma, which is an absolutely fascinating read. I'm going to go over this in the intro with everybody, so they're going to understand your credentials, but I want to just go over this real quick because I think this is an interesting take about your credentials than how you got into this sort of topic, which is not a materialistic topic, which kind of goes against the majority of your training, undergraduate work at Ohio, medical school at Johns Hopkins, postdoctoral work. You did training in London at the Institute of Psychiatry with Sir Michael Rudder, who was knighted for his work in autism, faculty at Harvard, where you taught neuropsychiatry, and the list goes on. Can you tell people, like I said, that's a materialistic education and background that you had. Can you tell people how you went from that and then you started researching ESP and telepathy in autistic savants? Hey guys, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for tuning in. If you're enjoying this episode and want to help us uncover more mysteries of the universe, don't forget to support Curious Dimension. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit the like button. It really helps get this content in front of more people who are curious just like you. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to click that notification bell too, so you're the first to know when we release new content. For those of you listening on your favorite podcast platform, make sure to follow or subscribe to the show and leave us a rating and review. It helps more than you know. And whether you're watching or listening, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below or send me a message. Thanks for being part of the Curious Dimension community. Your support keeps this journey going.
Sure. So, yeah, I was raised by a father who was a scientist, and I didn't even know religion existed. So I was raised in a materialist, atheistic model, and it was no big surprise that I became interested in neuroscience even before it was a major, and interested in, more specifically, what's the relationship between brain and consciousness. And I realized that it was human consciousness that I was the most interested in, although I found animals absolutely fascinating. I had studied animal behavior. But my intention was to become a neurosurgeon and to really do the work that was being done where neurosurgeons were recording from the brains of people who were undergoing surgery, and they would stimulate different regions of the brain to see what role that area of the brain fulfilled, so that they would not remove any unnecessary. If it wasn't necessary to remove it, if it had a strategic function, they would try to spare it. And so this is in the early years of neurosurgery, really mapping out the brain. And I thought, okay, I want to map out the brain. And it was after having that intention, going to medical school, having studied neuroscience, and then realizing at my medical school, Johns Hopkins, that the people who are really spending the time talking with people about what their inner experience of consciousness was and trying to map the brain with that, that the people who spent the most time doing that were actually neuropsychiatrists. And so I decided, okay, I'm not going to be a neurosurgeon who spends a lot of my time having people under anesthesia or just cutting out material. I want to spend a lot of time interviewing people and trying to find the neural correlates of their inner experiences. And it was after becoming a neuropsychiatrist and joining the faculty at Harvard that I met a patient that just rocked my worldview. It was like my experience with that patient back in, that would have been in around 1989. It was just similar to what a lot of people experienced who've witnessed my experience as of late, where they go in and you're open-minded, but at the same time, you predominantly think these things aren't real. And then you actually witness this. And so I was called in to evaluate a patient as a psychiatrist on a medical floor, and the patient had been admitted with a presumed heart attack. And we had to wait a couple of days to get the results back to know if she'd had a heart attack. And then she said to me when I went in to see her, and the staff all thought she was insane, and that wanted me to just come in and sign the paperwork saying she can't sign out against medical advice. She's not competent to. But when I came in and she said, I'm seeing ghosts and I know what my results and my tests are going to be. And so just let me go now and spare me the grief. And of course, as a doctor, I was responsible. I felt, no, I can't let you just walk out the door, but I wasn't going to just sign paperwork to remove her rights. Just on that. And literally within about 5 minutes, she said, I'm getting a reading on you and let me tell you what it is. And she told me all these specific things about my life, about my future that just turned my world upside down. And it's one of the reasons why I left academic medicine, because I knew that they were not, we're talking 30 years ago, I knew that they would not have a structure or a framework to even accept any of these phenomena. That I was told, if somebody says this to you, it means they're insane. And yet I had someone right in front of my own eyes prove it to me. And I also was privy to, as a neuropsychiatrist, I was also privy to all of these different phenomena that really were helping us to understand the brain's relationship to consciousness. And so I was already aware of things like near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, not from my training, but just from having talked to patients and hearing them express these things, and then going and doing my own research and saying, oh, wow, there's actually people who've written about this. This is the only person who's had this experience, and realizing there's more to this picture here. And so that's what set me off in this course. And I realized early on that if anybody is going to be having these experiences to an extraordinary degree that would be what is necessary to shift the paradigm, it would be autistics, and they would probably be recognized as savants because they would just know things that we didn't expect them to know. But if you just scratch it the surface a little deeper, you'll discover that, yeah, they that know a lot.
Now, why did you suspect that autistic savants might be, I guess, a subset of humans that would express this phenomenon more? Why them?
First of all, it really came from multiple different directions. And that's when you know that you're onto something, when if you think about it from different angles and it all points to the same thing. So, for example, I knew that savant skills, that is, knowing information like mathematics, foreign languages, music that you've never been trained in, and then somehow you're able to do it. Okay. I knew that is uncontested within science. Okay. There have been multiple cases of that where it's been reliably proven. And that's as mysterious to me as what we call ESP. That's as mysterious to me as telepathy, that they're accessing information somehow. Okay. So I knew that. Then the next thing was that I realized that people like Bernard Rimland, who had studied thousands of people who were autistic and also had studied people who had savant syndrome, found that a certain percentage of them, just a small percentage back then in his reports, 3%, had abilities that we would call ESP, precognition, telepathy, clairvoyance. So they were accessing information non-locally, not just this information stream that's, oh, how do you calendar calculate or generate prime numbers, but something that we would put into the category of ESP. Then I also thought about how if you look at what is the brainwave activity, what is the pattern of how we use our brain? If you think of our brain as like having different apps within it, okay, and each of these apps has their own circuitry, okay? And so what app is being used by people when they have these experiences versus another app where no, you're not going to have those experiences. That app is for your everyday life or whatever. I knew that there was so much research shown that people who are not normally considered psychic can have psychic dreams. They can have very specific information, whether it's like somebody just died and that person comes to them in a dream, or somebody's injured and they have a dream about that person being injured. In fact, the person who developed the EEG, the device that is used by neurologists to measure brain waves.
Hans Berger?
Yes, Hans Berger. What
Okay.
inspired him to invent the EEG was an experience in which his sister contacted him because she was afraid he was involved in a serious accident, and she contacted him by telegram. And he was in an accident where he was almost killed. And so those kinds of experiences is like, how is that possible for people to have that? And in dreaming sleep, I knew that people who ordinarily wouldn't say I'm psychic can have those experiences. And what we know about dreaming sleep is that during dreaming sleep, the frontal lobes are turned down, turned off, and the right hemisphere of the brain is more dominant than the left hemisphere. And if you think about that's interesting because most of us are very left hemisphere dominant, especially going through our educational system. And most of us, we're using our frontal lobes to think, to strategize, to do analytical thinking, to predict what's going to happen, engage in all of these tasks. And so I thought, okay, so who is it that has in the waking state, has the brainwave patterns that we normally associate with the dreaming sleep state? And I was like, that's going to be somebody who's autistic, particularly an autistic savant, because what we associate with the left hemisphere, those skills, that's very language based. That's very linear thinking. And if it's savant skills, that's very gestalt thinking, holistic. You just get the answer at full blown. You're not deriving it. It's just there for you. It's like you're downloading it, plucking it as a fruit, fully formed fruit. That's, as I said, that's the brain of autistic savants. And so I said, okay. And they're doing these things when they're awake. And so I put that out there. And shortly, I say it in my book, I've said it in scientific conferences. And shortly after I did that, I started getting contacted by people who work with this population saying, you're absolutely right. This is what we've witnessed. We just have never seen anybody in science ever
Take it seriously.
take it
Or
seriously
pose the question.
or pose the question. Exactly.
So what year is this that you put this out there, and how much blowback did you get from colleagues at this time and from the community that you were in?
First time that I put it out there was actually before I wrote the book, The ESP Enigma. I gave a talk at the Science of Consciousness conference in Copenhagen, in which I talked about savant skills and the brain activity that I thought would be involved in that, and how I thought that it was very similar to dreaming sleep and et cetera, et cetera. I did that in 2005.
Okay.
I wrote my book, the ESP Enigma, in 2007. It was the first copy. The hardcover copy was published in 2008, and the paperback was 2009. And it wasn't until so I put this book out there. It's very grounded in science. It was favorably reviewed by my alma mater, Johns Hopkins Medical School, and their alumni magazine. I was translated in multiple languages, and it's in several university libraries. But my medical board in 2010 just saw the title of it and said, "Oh, we've got a psychiatrist out there saying that there's a scientific case for ESP." And that was enough for them to temporarily suspend my license.
Really? Just
Yes.
and did they hadn't even read the book?
No, they just saw the title.
So I guess that's a clear indication of where the consensus was, I guess, in mainstream. So that was in 2010. Here we are, 2014. How much of that has changed over the last 14 years?
It's changed tremendously.
I imagine. It does seem like the tide is shifting with a lot of these sort of topics that were highly taboo even 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But it does seem like the tide is shifting and people are being much more open to this. Despite the fact that we've had evidence of this for quite a long time, it seems like. It's not like you were the first one to write about this. There's been people who've written about this for a long time.
Exactly.
And you cite them in your book.
Exactly. I say that we don't, the neuroscience's paradigm for how the brain works and produces consciousness, there's no there. Okay. The hard problem
The hard problem.
the hard problem of consciousness is, how does the brain create consciousness? We don't have a clue, but we're certain that it does. Okay, so they set it up as, okay, you can't challenge this, but somehow you're supposed to create all of these like fanciful theories for how this whole thing works. So I just blew through as a neuroscientist. I could say that the emperor has no clothes. Someone who's not a neuroscientist can't say that necessarily with the same impact as I could. Then, as a neuropsychiatrist, I'm then coming forward and I'm saying, once again, I'm poking pins into their all, because I'm saying, okay, here I am, a neuropsychiatrist. I'm the person who also determines who's sane and who's not. And I'm saying, not everybody who says they have these experiences is insane. There are times when what they say they're experiencing seems to have some validity. That was threatening in and of itself. So I think that the reason why they came down so hard on me is because I have precisely the credentials from precisely the institutions that made me dangerous. Paradigm. And they had to shut it down.
Right. They had to make an example because it threatens it threatens it threatens the paradigm, the knowledge base, the textbooks, everything that's been created around a certain narrative. And when somebody comes and threatens that narrative, yeah, that story is as old as history itself. It's whenever somebody comes in and challenges the status quo, people get all up in arms because they're afraid of losing what they have. Can we go over some of the more profound cases that you were involved with and some of the people that you worked with that just blew you away with some of the amazing abilities and data that you uncovered?
Sure. Yeah. I don't even know where to start, really.
I know there's a lot. How about I pick one? Because, I've done a little bit of research. How about, I think this individual's a little bit older now, but is it Ramsey?
Yes.
Let's talk about Ramsey for a second, because this individual, I think, was famous through a video that was put out. And did you do an experiment with that as well?
Oh, yeah. No. So, yeah. So let me tell you a little bit about Ramses. So it's Ramses as in the Pharaoh. Okay.
Okay, Ramses.
Ramses. And his mother, when she was pregnant with him, she's from Colombia, and her husband was Colombian, and he joined the military, and they were in Florida, stationed there. And she had the sense that this child that she was going to give birth to was in a some extraordinary individual, and she decided to name him Ramses. And when he was 4 months old, he started not only speaking, but he started reading and speaking bilingually. So she had Spanish as her first tongue, and he was doing English and Spanish. Okay.
Mhm.
By the age of 2, he knew the alphabet and was able to read on a rudimentary level at minimum 8 different languages.
8.
8: Japanese, Hebrew, Hindi, Arabic, Russian, Spanish, English. And it was one of those things where the mother said, "Okay, I can see where he gets the Japanese, and I can see where he gets the Spanish and the English." Because the mother had an interest, so she spoke English and Spanish, and she had a fascination with the Japanese culture. She said, "I don't understand where the Hebrew or the Hindi." The
Is
other
he
thing, yeah,
speaking this with no instruction? He's just
yeah.
speaking it?
He's reading it and speaking it, yeah, with no instruction.
So
At
he's
the age
accessing this from somewhere.
He's accessing it from somewhere, yeah. And I was just like, "Wow, okay." I've heard of savants that can do this. It's extraordinary. And then she said, and not only that, he's telepathic, and he's able to do math and all of these things. So I was like, "Okay, I've got to go evaluate this child."
Mhm.
And so I met him when he was 5 years old, and he was able to I could have the mother across the room. And he's somebody who's a speaker, so he's not somebody who's nonverbal. He's not one of the ones who's having to point to a letterboard. And I could show the mother a number, and then she would think it, and he would speak it out loud from across the room.
And you were using random number generators, correct?
At that point, I wasn't using random number generators, but I was I'm just sh I'm not yet doing that, but within 2 years, I was testing him using random number generators, and he was doing the same thing. But in the beginning, it was me just thinking of a number off the top of my head to give the mother. I witnessed him reading an astronomy book at the age of 5, and I could ask him, "What's the cube root of a number?" and he'd give me the answer.
Mm.
And
Like
so,
the cube root of, like, a large number.
yeah, and I could and he was also had this game that he played where he would play on the computer with virtual Legos, and he would be stacking them like this. He already knew what the perspective of them was from up above, because the main reason why he was stacking them was to create an image that you would view from a different
Above.
above, yes.
Interesting.
And and so I saw and I tested him for, okay, here's Arabic letter, or here's a Hindu symbol or whatever, and he knew what it was. And in fact, it was one of those things where pulled up an image of the periodic table, and he goes, "Oh, no." 5 years old. He go, "Oh, no, that's an old periodic table." He already was aware of a periodic table that had some element
Right.
in that one. 5 years old. And extremely remarkable, and there was a video done of experiments that I did with him using a random number generator that was filmed by a media production company out of Germany, and it went viral
Mm.
worldwide. And that was at least 9 years ago.
Yeah, and that's an extraordinary case. There was another case I had saw of, I think it was a young girl, nonverbal, who was able to the woman testing her had the numbers in front of her, maybe 18 digits long, and it was a multiplication problem, and she was not only did she know the numbers, but she was doing the numbers with the multiplication. Are you familiar with who I'm talking about?
You're probably talking about Haley.
Yes, that's correct. Was she tested, like, over 100 times in a certain session and had, like, an extraordinary accuracy?
Oh, yeah, I spent probably so I did 3 different, more than this, but I mean, I went there one weekend and did 3 sessions of 2 hours each and with 2 different therapists, okay? And she for 2 hours straight was just doing it out with their answers, okay, on her stencil board. And she, before we put the barrier between her and the therapist she was having this experience with, she was able to type onto an iPad, but she regressed a little bit and was using a stencil when we were doing it with all the cameras and the barrier between her. But anyway, she easily had 97% accuracy.
And we're talking like 18 some digit numbers.
Oh, we're talking out of a string of something like 162 numbers. She only had 7 mistakes, and she corrected them on the next try.
That's astounding. And you're talking about that's an extraordinary case of somebody who's clearly showing high accuracy using some sort of ESP or telepathy. So there's an example right there. You have an example. And she's not the only one. There's lots and lots of these different types of examples of ESP. Where do you see the scientific community now? I mean, it's probably a little bit more accepted now, but if you could give a percentage of it, is it like 50% of the scientific community would acknowledge this? Or is it that they're just not aware of the work that's been done?
That's hard for me to say. It really is hard for me to say. What I would say is a high percentage of them they're clueless as to the work that's been done, okay, because they don't read those journals, go to those conferences, listen to those podcasts. They're not on social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they have a world that's very siloed by the publications that they've been taught to only trust this and that. What I'm wanting to do is get my research published in one of those publications like Science or Nature, where then that's really what's going to blow it up. But at the same time, the scientists are human. And so a lot of them have had these experiences. They just haven't felt safe to talk about it. Whether it's that they didn't feel safe in terms of coming out professionally, or they themselves had some cognitive dissonance that they just would rather just not think about it. There's all these different ways in which people who were raised, educationally to believe a certain way, that there's all these different stages that people go through. There's different ways that people react to the information. And so what I'd say is that the younger generation, people that your age, that these younger generations, they've been raised with why not? They've been raised with a lot of pretty fantastic things that makes them more open-minded to it as a possibility than some of the people who are older. And say that a lot of my fan base who follow my work are people who are the millennials.
Yeah. When you grow up so I'm 46 and I grew up half of my life really without the internet. And then the second half of my life, it just exploded and it's everywhere and information is everywhere. And I can absolutely see how somebody being born into that over the last 20 years, you have access to anything you want to know. So curiosity is just this seed that can just bloom into the most anything you want, because anything you want to know and are curious about is there for you. And if you're curious about UFOs or you're curious about ESP or whatever it is, you can go find real research on those topics. And then, you're going to be open-minded to these things because you're going to have those seeds planted. Have you noticed cultural perspectives that are different around the world? Like maybe certain countries are more open to this than others?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. For example, if you go to India, you're just talking about cities. That is what they call ESP skulls. It's just, that's a city. They were never taught that this is incorrect or that this is wrong. So initially, some of my best cases in terms of people who contacted me with their kid demonstrating these abilities were people who came from those kinds of countries, Sri Lanka or India, or places that already have a different way of thinking about consciousness. They didn't throw away their ancient wisdom traditions. And where I found that there was the most opposition was both in the atheistic, materialistically oriented people who, that their take on how the world works is all based on what people like Rupert Sheldrake would call scientism. Science as a religion, that there's certain dogmas that you don't question, like the brain creates consciousness, that kind of thing. So those are the ones who have the greatest difficulty with it. I'd say the other people who have the greatest difficulty with it are, it's not that they disbelieve in it, it's that they believe that it's dangerous because they've been raised like in a fundamentalist Christian religion, and they think that anybody who's dabbling with this is dabbling with the occult, or that the Bible says you shouldn't be doing this, which it's just strange if you think about it, because the Bible is full of prophets, but full of people who have these abilities, but it's somehow as if you were born past the 4th century AD. You're suddenly, it's supposed to have stopped. Those things were okay if you were Jesus Christ and one of his early disciples.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of these ideas of ESP. Yeah, these stories are entrenched in our myth, in our religions. You would think that it would be reinforced by that. Acknowledge that this absolutely exists. There's plenty of data to support that. So what is then the theories that kind of go along with this? Is there some sort of field that every human being is connected to, and that we somehow, certain individuals are able to access this information and they're drawing it in? Because if you look at it, some of these occurrences are temporal, like seeing into the future, things that are going to happen. So what are some of the working theories behind what's going on?
I think, first of all, let's start with some of the things that physicists were saying over 100 years ago that really changed physics in terms of its description of reality, but it somehow didn't percolate into the human experience of reality. So, for example, you had Einstein's theory of relativity, which said our perception of time is an illusion. Yeah, and started thinking time and space is being connected in a way that, like the idea of the block universe, where there time is treated like a full dimension, not just a dimension that can only move like an arrow from here forward and never can go backwards. Okay, never can be traveled in any other way. And so, if you just expand your view of time as something that's a flexible dimension and a true dimension, like you think of three-dimensional reality, and it's like that changes a lot. Okay, then if you think us as being able to, what we do is we're navigating space-time. And so what's happened is that we've become almost like the trolley car. Yeah, that's, oh, I'm on this track and this is the only way that I can experience space-time. But that's only a very directed experience of space-time, and not the totality of space-time that currently exists. So the theory of relativity, and then subsequent theories like string theory, that talks about that not only is it that our sense of time is incorrect, but that there's actually more dimensions than the 3 physical dimensions that we imagine. It's just that we are so locked into the way that our sensory system fools us into a certain way of relating to information and categorizing it as things as being solid, that we know from the studies of subatomic physics are not solid. It's predominantly space, etc. Or this idea that that particles themselves are really, they're not little balls. They're not tiny little marbles rolling around that you can connect together, like you can connect Tinker Toys or something.
Mhm.
That the reality is that particles themselves have wave-like properties. that really that whether and that what those things that we think of as a wave, like light, has particle-like properties. And it's so much of it is how you're measuring it, how you're perceiving it. Perceiving is a measurement. So we're defining things and putting it into a particular form because that's what we need to navigate through. But it doesn't mean that's like the true ultimate reality. And so a lot of what I think is so exciting about these kinds of experiments is that it's really looking at that human interface with a greater reality that we've had mystics and we've had physicists, great physicists like Einstein and Bohr tell us that, yeah, that this better defines reality.
It sounds like you were treading around the double slit experiment there,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
which could you explain that to everybody, just for anybody who doesn't understand that and how that relates to what you were talking about, how you've got particles, then you have waves, and that maybe the observer might be actually creating that solid thing?
Yeah, so in the double slit experiment, basically what you have is you have these two slits and let's say slits in a fabric and the fabric can block whatever it is you're trying to transmit through the slits, whether it's an electron or a photon. It can block it from going past that to something that's going to be measuring it on the other side. And so you know that if it's going through, it's going through one slit or the other. And what you're doing is you're singularly going, okay, I'm gonna send an electron or I'm gonna send a photon through this slit or that slit. Okay. And if you are there measuring it while you're doing it, you get what you would expect if you were to just have the materialist model of, oh, I'm throwing little teeny balls through that slit. What you would expect on the other side, that is the detection of these things, is
Uniform.
splats. Well, like a splat, multiple little places where it hit and was recorded, and so you've got two blotches on either side of the split, right? In the double slit experiment, what happened is yes, that's what you got if you were there observing it. But if you run the system and you're like, I'm not going to observe it. I'm not going to even, I'm just going to let it run. Okay. The way I had it set up when I was standing here watching it all. And what is you see an interference pattern. Instead of those two splotches, you see an interference pattern. And the only way you can get an interference pattern, which is stripes of basically two waves
Mm.
coming and interfering with one another, so that you get that gradation that you
Mhm.
only see if two waves are coming through. And so the conclusion of that was as phenomenal and extraordinary as it is to believe, is that the particle, the electron, the photon had to go through both slits simultaneously.
Mm.
Something about the act of measurement forces it to go through one or the other. But if you're not measuring it, then it's going through both simultaneously, and it's really
It's showing a wave of possibilities.
exactly, which is consistent with the idea that Heisenberg with the uncertainty principle is that
Mhm.
if you measure the momentum, you can't know the position, or you can't, if you're trying to, zero in too much on this system that really is full of potentiality, it has to always have a little bit of wiggle room. Always and the only way you can have it totally defined is if you're really honing in on it, and measuring it, just measuring the heck out of it.
Mm.
And then, okay, it'll do what you expect it to do, but turn your back 1 minute
Mhm.
and that potentiality will express itself. That's really the message that's showing us. And so to me, that's a statement about how we co-create our reality.
Mhm.
because we're constantly measuring just by observation and judgment.
And that's the key word, because there's an observer, and because there's an observer, something is then that experiment is going to be fundamentally flawed because you have the person looking at it, and so that person all the data is coming from that person. But if you take the person out of it, that's probably the reality of it when no one's there to observe something. That's fascinating, and I love the way you described it. Thank you for that. One of the things I've been starting to research a little bit more is, and I know you touched on this a little bit in your book. I haven't finished your book, so I don't know if you dive deep into this later chapters, but is the remote viewing topic, which has been around. We know the government was funding this in the 70s at least. I've had this logical thought that I don't see why they would get rid of something if it's an extra layer of intelligence. So I don't know why they would do that, but from everything I've read and some of the research papers I've looked at, it looks like it works if they follow these sort of set of protocols. So I was wondering if you could just speak to a little bit about remote viewing and how you think that fits into this conversation.
Sure. Boy, yeah, that's a pretty general question. Remote viewing is the term that has been used by the scientists who were doing this with military funding, military intelligence funding, and they would be able to describe scenes at a distance. And it might be a scene that all they had was geophysical coordinates. So it's X number of degrees north and X number of degrees west, and then it might describe what's there. Or it may be describe what this other person is looking at, where this other person that has gone to. What is it that this person is seeing? And it's a word that's used for what some people would call clairvoyance. So you're seeing something at a distance. And what was remarkable was that to a high degree, a lot of people were able to be trained to be remote viewers who they were in the military, they were selected to do this, and some of them, they had no idea that they had this ability before they were selected. And yet they would just be asked to do something, and then they would just draw or write what it is that came to them. And some of the best remote viewers were people who didn't think they even had the abilities. And so the question is, if you're being asked to draw what it is that the scene of someplace else,
And they're blind to this. They
and they're
don't know
blind, they have
they don't
no
know they don't know what they don't know what the target is.
They don't know what the target is. They just have something that maybe anchors them there, and the thing that anchors them there is, oh,
A
well, it's
random number or something.
no, it's more geophysical coordinates. But this is back before Google Earth, okay? I couldn't enter in those coordinates. So imagine before Google Earth using a human being and saying, I want you to do the Google Earth thing. I'm going to give you a physical address and I want you to tell me what it looks like. And to be able to draw it. And it's really profound. Or no physical address, but somebody that is there observing it, that yeah, and you're supposed to pick up on them. And so what I think it really probably does relate to this idea of entanglement, that I think that just people talk about how if you have two particles that are entangled with one another and you separate them and you affect one of them, you instantaneously affect the other one. So that whole notion of entanglement that gets discussed a lot. If we live in this sort of interconnected universe, some of what that interconnection means is this entanglement, and that entanglement can be between a place, for example, and what it looks like, and what it has been assigned in terms of geophysical coordinates. If we said this spot on the globe has these coordinates, and we don't deviate from saying that, nobody's changing that, then there's an entanglement between that address for that spot. And then if you were saying at this time or in the future, or whatever, then you're entangling it. And where psychometry, when somebody gives you an object and you have the ability of psychometry, they'll give you the gun from a crime scene and you hold the gun, like Peter Hurkos could do this. You hold it and then he would have the whole crime scene flash in front of him. He could describe what the murderer looked like and maybe even where they were located now, because that object that was at the scene is entangled with all the information that is associated with it.
That's amazing that someone could connect with that and then access that information. So that does suggest that there's energy around there that someone's picking up on that, and then their brain is able to decode that information so that they can understand what is going on there. Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Gary Nolan over at Stanford?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. He's been studying brains and identifying certain areas of the brains for people that are experiencers, and they think these parts of the brain might have something to do with intuition, like the quadripetunum and the basal ganglia, and they're showing neuronal density around these areas that may be giving people more information. So if what you're saying is correct, that everything is all connected, it's possible that these little parts of the brain are giving certain individual shards of information from different times. And it may be that people like these autistic savants, is it true that in autistic savants that there is like a decreasing in the barrier between the left and the right part of the brain? Is that cephaly? What is that? Is that hypocephaly?
Okay, you bring up several things here. So let me just address a little bit of it. One of the things I talk about in my book is that the brain has a GPS. And at the time that I wrote my book, I was aware of the fact that a GPS system had been identified in animals and it's been identified in humans. And what I mean by GPS is that we have a section of the brain that has place cells, grid cells, and speed cells. So these cells are detecting where you are in your map so for example, a big cat that has a hunting territory. When you are physically in a certain section of that territory, the brain is sending signals saying you're in that section of the territory. Just like that little blue dot on your Google Maps when you're going, oh, there's my car, and here I am in the road map. The brain does that for our own map, for our territory, okay? And then you've got speed cells, so that it's like that can track how fast you're going, okay? So that once again, there's a corollary to that. Just now they've got apps for people that it's like, oh, you want to get a discount on your driver's insurance? We'll give you this app and we can see if you're speeding. Anyway, we've got those kind of cells in our brain, okay? And so how is that possible that our brain already does that? It's because our brain is really is part of it's a navigational instrument for space-time itself. I truly believe this.
Mm.
And that what we're doing when we develop some of these skills is we're developing the ability to have more of a compass. What we're developing is that input system where, like, you look at your GPS, it's like, where are you now? It always knows where you are. Okay. Where are you going? You put that in. And then what they've developed is that ability to then map out the things so that you can then get there with your consciousness. That's like the analogy I use for it. It's
Interesting. Fascinating. Yeah. So it's like the brain is constantly mapping all these territories, and it's giving you all this information so that you can basically you can survive in this world, and you can understand your place in it, and yeah, and you can it's been specifically designed to keep you alive, and that is unbelievable. Dan, this is a fascinating conversation. I'm really enjoying this. I just wanted to I just have one more question for you. Could we talk a little bit about Kim Peek and the abilities he had, and specifically what his brain, what he had going on inside of his brain, and why maybe we think he was able to be such a savant in the way that he was? Maybe first of all, could you tell everybody who Kim Peek is?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So Kim Peek is the person after whom Rain Man was modeled, the movie Rain Man. And he was someone who was considered, he was definitely a savant. Daryl Treffert studied him. And the thing where people are mistaken is that they oftentimes say that they think he's an autistic savant. He actually wasn't autistic. He had a condition called hydrocephalus, and that's a condition in which you don't reabsorb the cerebrospinal fluid properly. And so you can have this buildup of pressure of this fluid in your brain. And in infancy, which is when this occurred with him, your fontanelles aren't closed yet. Your brain is capable of pushing out against the skull, which is still very often, it's not fused yet. And so what happened is that he had this huge head that was so heavy that he couldn't even hold it upright, which is why
Physically.
he physically, he literally, you'd see him like this. And if you looked at his MRI, you saw that he has this big cavity in the center of his brain because he didn't have the corpus callosum, which is the major set of nerve fibers that connect the left and the right hemisphere. It's a huge component of the brain, and it's just totally missing. And so here he had a very, what we would consider a disconnected brain.
Mm.
And yet at the same time, he had one of the most profound memories one could imagine. By the time he was in his mid-50s, he had already memorized over 12,000 books and could recite them forwards and backwards. That's
astounding.
And then he also could give you directions between any two cities in the US, and I think even beyond the US. His memory was so phenomenal. And he's somebody who set me on this journey of going, we've got the idea of memory incorrect. The information, I really don't believe that the information is stored in the neuronal wiring. And that's not where the information's stored. I see that the brain as being what helps us to navigate an informational field where the information is actually stored. And another thing about Kim Peek that was also fascinating is, and it's probably related to the fact that he didn't have this, he had such a disconnected brain and didn't have the corpus callosum, was that he could read two books simultaneously, one with each eye.
And just read them and absorb them.
Read them and absorb them.
That's what kind of information can you get when someone can do that? This is telling you that someone has a high level of processing power and that is able to retain this information, and that also doesn't have a corpus callosum. That's a major part of the brain that's connecting the right and the left. So it does suggest that there is something else going on there with the mind, and that the brain is maybe just some sort of receiver that helps us process these things. And he's got this condition that's exhibiting this ability that maybe through evolution, other people might eventually be able, maybe through evolution, other human beings might eventually be able to access. But that's an amazing story. Diane, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really want to thank you for joining me on the show. Before we go, can you just tell everybody where to find you, your website, what you've got coming down the pipe?
Oh, yeah, sure. So they can find me at DRDIANE Hennacy HENACY.com. And boy, lots of things coming down the way. The most people are now who are probably listening to your podcast are probably aware of the telepathy tapes. They're exploding on the internet. And I'm really excited about the fact that I'm now getting people coming forward who really want to fund my research. They really see how significant and important it is. And so I'm planning on now finally being able to do the studies I've been wanting to do for a long time, publishing them, and continuing to evolve the paradigm.
Thank you so much for being a maverick, Diane. This has been a fantastic conversation. So thanks everybody for watching. Check out the Telepathy Tapes and check out Diane. Thanks everybody. Thanks for watching the show. I hope you guys are enjoying the content. If you're finding any value, please hit that subscribe button, that like button, and leave a comment. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really helps out the show.